He walked into the courthouse, wearing the same suit he was once celebrated in, only this time. They whispered, "He's lost everything," someone muttered. But when he stepped outside hand in hand with a barefoot girl from the shelter, the cameras turned. No one understood why a disgraced millionaire would choose a child the world had already written off. And yet, there was something in the way she looked at numbers on the wall. If this story pulls at something deep in you, stay with us. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a thought. It means more than you think. The rain came down in long, slanting lines, streaking across the glass towers of downtown San Francisco and pooling in slick, reflective patches on the stone pavements of Union Square. People passed quickly through it, their coats darkened at the seams, their umbrellas moving like clockwork gears in a city that rarely paused. Outside the Westin St. Francis, the glass doors opened with a muted hiss and released a flood of well-dressed guests into the gray afternoon. Laughter mingled with the clink of heels and the dull thump of leather soles, each person eager to return to a life warm with taxis, dry suits, and dinner reservations. David Langston moved against the flow. He wore a coat too thin for the weather and shoes with a worn line along the soles. He didn't hurry. He hadn't hurried in years. Not since the collapse. Not since his name had disappeared from the corner offices and appeared instead on the ticker crawl of financial scandal segments across every national news network. To them, he looked like a man drifting, maybe recently fired, maybe just another shadow in a city that didn't care for explanations. No one stopped him, and that suited him fine. At the edge of the square, beneath the long awning of a shuttered gift kiosk, sat a girl, 12, maybe 13. Her jeans were soaked at the hems and too short for her legs. A maroon hoodie covered most of her head. But from where David stood, he could see her eyes clear, alert, and watching everything. She was surrounded by cranes, dozens of them, each folded neatly from newspaper scraps, takeout menus, old receipts. A small piece of cardboard leaned beside her origami. $1. Just need to sleep inside. No decoration, no smiley faces, just ink and hope. David paused. The girl kept folding. Her fingers moved like she'd done this 1,000 times, each crease precise, every wing symmetrical. There was a rhythm to it, as if the motion itself was keeping her steady in the rain. She didn't call out, didn't beg. She didn't need to. Her silence was a kind of message, one that lingered longer than any cry for help. A man in a blue wool coat walked past and chuckled as he dropped a crumpled bill into her plastic cup. Selling dreams. City's full of those already. The girl didn't react, but David turned to the man and said, not sharply, but with the kind of flatness that carried weight, "Maybe she's selling something the rest of us forgot how to believe in." The man glanced at him, frowned, and kept walking. David stepped closer. The cranes weren't random. They were arranged by size, color, even type of paper like a display. He crouched beside them, not quite looking at the girl. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked. She looked up, her face streaked with rain but unflinching. "Long enough to know which corners work, which don't." "You live around here, I sleep around here," she said. Then, without pause, "You're David Langston." He blinked. "Am I?" "I." She nodded, then reached into the pocket of her hoodie and pulled out a folded, weather-damaged clipping. She held it out, and David took it without a word. The ink had bled in places, but the headline was still visible. Langston resigns amid financial collapse, 200 Daveners missing. His face stared up at him from 3 years ago, clean-shaven, stern, standing at a podium under too many lights. David let out a breath and handed the paper back. "And you kept that because people don't just disappear," she said. "They fall, and sometimes they land where the rest of us already are." He sat back on his heels. She was small, but not fragile. Not really. There was something in her posture, straight-backed, ready, that said she'd survived more than she should have. "What's your name?" he asked. "Eliza. Where's your family?" She didn't answer. just resumed folding. David stood up, feeling the weight of his coat pressing down as the rain picked up again. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a $5 bill, laying it gently in the cup. She didn't thank him, just nodded once and kept folding. He turned to leave. "Mr. Langston," she said behind him. He stopped. "I don't sell dreams. I sell patterns." He looked back. Patterns. She pointed to the cranes. People move like weather. If you watch long enough, you see the shapes they make. David didn't respond. He just nodded and walked on, his hands in his pockets, the chill creeping deeper into his bones. He crossed the street and looked back once. Eliza was gone. The cranes remained. David Langston unlocked the rusted gate of the building and stepped into the narrow hallway of his apartment complex. The elevator hadn't worked in months. Not that it mattered, his place was on the ground floor, pressed between the laundry room and a storage closet no one claimed. A flickering motion sensor light buzzed overhead as he slid the key into his door. Inside, the air was stale. The scent of instant noodles, old paper, and damp carpet hung low like a ceiling too heavy to breathe beneath. The apartment was barely more than a box, a small kitchen with peeling linoleum, a folding table, a single chair, a twin bed pushed against the wall under a narrow window. Along one side, an old file cabinet leaned crookedly, one drawer stuck half open, stuffed with manila folders and printouts from a time when those numbers meant something. Now, they were just ghosts in ink remnants of deals, clients, systems he once mastered and lost all at once. He turned on the stove. The electric coil groaned to life as he dropped a packet of ramen into a dented saucepan. He didn't add anything, no vegetables, no egg, no seasoning, just the noodles, curling in silence. He sat, staring at the blank wall opposite him. His eyes weren't really fixed on anything, but in his mind, a face kept appearing, small, calm, watching. Eliza, that strange, observant girl with wet sleeves and dry eyes. Her voice had stuck with him steady, unafraid, and somehow sharper than it should have been for someone her age. He didn't know why she stayed in his thoughts. He'd walked past dozens like her in the last few years, but she hadn't asked for anything. That, he realized, made her unforgettable. Across the city, in the quiet corner of a cafe, tucked between a laundromat and a pawn shop in the outer Mission. Eliza stirred her tea slowly. It wasn't really tea. It was hot water with a slice of lemon, given freely by the woman behind the counter, who never asked questions as long as you sat still and didn't scare the customers. Eliza fit that category perfectly. Her coat was zipped up to the neck. Her sneakers were lined with paper to stay dry. She pulled a napkin from the dispenser, flattened it on the table, and began writing. Numbers, equations. Not the kind from school books. The kind that spoke in loops, curves, and forecasts. She didn't think about what she was doing. It was how she settled herself, like breathing with a pen. One equation bled into another, the napkin filling up fast. She paused only to glance out the window, not looking at anything in particular. Then she saw him. The man from yesterday, David Langston. She had studied his photo for over a year from news articles, financial blogs, even a podcast that blamed him for the market ripple that had shuttered her mother's workplace. She'd memorized the arc of his fall. But yesterday, watching him kneel beside her paper cranes and speak softly to that man in the blue coat, none of that matched what she'd read. That man wasn't broken. He was paused. Back in his apartment, David finished the last spoonful of broth, stood, and pulled open the file cabinet. He removed a thin folder, the tab labeled Whitmore Capital, Internal Anomalies. He hadn't looked at this in almost 2 years. Hadn't dared. But something in him had shifted. Not because of the data, but because of a girl who could see patterns in puddles. The next morning, David pushed the glass door of the corner bodega 2 blocks from his building. The bell above the frame jingled. He was reaching for a container of instant coffee when he caught movement in the far corner. There, by the magazine rack, sitting cross-legged, was Eliza. A tray of folded cranes beside her, a small cardboard sign propped against the shelf. She looked up and met his eyes like she'd been expecting him. "You followed me?" he asked. Not angry, just surprised. Eliza shook her head. "I calculated your route from Union Square. This place had a 72% chance of being your neighborhood store." David blinked. Then, without thinking, he said, "That's a pretty good guess." "It's not a guess," she replied. He took a slow breath, unsure what to say next. She leaned forward, pulled something from her coat, and held it out to him. Another napkin. This one filled with equations, symbols, and 2 words at the top: forecast model, human pattern variability. He took it, turned it over in his hands. "I don't know what this is," he said. "You don't have to," Eliza said quietly, "but you'll want to." The heat clicked on with a reluctant groan, pushing warm air from a vent that hadn't worked properly since last winter. David set a chipped ceramic mug in front of Eliza, its rim stained faintly from years of black coffee. Steam curled up, slow and thin. The room wasn't exactly warm, but it was warmer than the rain. Eliza sat at the folding table, her hands wrapped around the mug, not drinking yet. Her coat, damp at the sleeves, had begun to leave faint watermarks on the vinyl seat cushion. She didn't look cold. She looked used to it. David stood in the tiny kitchen space, stirring powdered soup into hot water. He didn't know what else to offer. There were 2 cans of chili, some crackers from a month ago, and half a lemon in the fridge. None of it felt like the right thing to give a child, but he didn't ask what she wanted. He just brought the bowl over and set it down. "You eaten today?" he asked. Eliza shrugged. "1 meal a day's usually enough, if you time it right." He watched her pick up the spoon. She didn't eat fast, but she didn't hesitate either. There was something precise about the way she moved, no wasted motion, no glancing around the room like a kid out of place. She belonged anywhere because she expected nowhere to keep her. On the wall behind her, David's maps still hung old banking flowcharts, territory breakdowns, asset trees. They were yellowed at the corners, curling slightly, some overlapping others where he'd thumbtacked new sheets instead of removing the old ones. No one else had seen them in years. Eliza tilted her head slightly toward them. "Those are from Whitmore, aren't they?" David froze mid-step. He didn't answer. She kept eating for a moment, then set the spoon down and pulled a napkin from her coat pocket. A pen followed. In a single motion, she began writing, not doodling, not scribbling, but marking out numbers and arrows, connecting them in curves and points across the paper like she'd done it 100 times. He stepped closer, watching as she labeled each junction in the model. Her hand moved fast. "Sure." She paused only once, pointing at a node. "Here," she said. "This isn't stable. The model looks fine, but the way capital splits here, someone was bleeding liquidity." Quietly. David didn't sit. He didn't move. "That model never went public." He said quietly, "I know." He picked up the napkin. The notations weren't guesses. They were replications down to the margin markers, the projected growth differentials, the exact flaw that had haunted him in silence for years. The kind of flaw that a forensic audit hadn't found, but he had. Too late. "Where did you see this?" he asked, more sternly than he meant. Eliza didn't flinch. I didn't. I ran patterns, from pieces, then guessed where the missing weight must have gone. He sat. Finally. Slowly. "You guessed I watched people," she said, "and watched how their movements didn't match the math. Then I learned the math." David didn't speak for a long time. The soup between them cooled. She folded her hands in her lap, then said softly, "You were the last one to sign off on the model before it went live, right?" He closed his eyes. "I wasn't the one who built it," he said, "but I let it pass." Eliza nodded, not accusingly, but like that was the final piece she hadn't been sure about. He looked at her then, really looked. A girl who'd been sitting on a sidewalk 24 hours ago, folding paper. Now she sat at his table, diagnosing the financial collapse that had taken down half his world. "What are you?" he asked. The question left his lips before he thought it through. She lifted her eyes to his. I don't know, but I know when something's off. People say they believe in systems, but systems don't lie. People do. He held the napkin again, the edges already softening from her damp coat. He should have felt threatened. He should have asked her to leave, but instead, he said, There's more of this. She nodded. I can show you. Outside, the city still dripped under a soft, endless rain. Inside, David finally saw something he hadn't in years, not just the flaw, but the possibility of finding where it led. He didn't speak, just turned the napkin over and picked up a pen. The apartment had settled into that peculiar silence only found late at night, when the city's noise turned distant, like a memory playing from another room. A faint hum came from the heater, trying to breathe life into the thin walls. The ticking of the old clock above the stovetop marked time as if nothing had changed. Though David Langston knew something had shifted the moment Eliza had placed that napkin in his hand. She had fallen asleep on the sofa, her small frame curled like she was used to making herself disappear into narrow corners. Her hoodie was pulled halfway over her eyes, her breath steady. One of her hands still rested on the edge of the table, close to the napkin she had drawn on, as if she were guarding it even in sleep. David sat alone at the table, the same seat he'd used for contracts, quarterly reports, resignation letters, and now this. He unfolded the napkin again, laying it flat beside a sheet of printer paper from his old files. The patterns were there identical, not similar, identical. The same structure he had once paid consultants hundreds of thousands of dollars to produce, the same model he had relied on to track asset movement inside Whitmore Capital. And there, near the lower right quadrant, a tiny mark, a rupture point. The flaw. She had seen it. It wasn't the kind of mistake a novice would catch. It was the kind that only surfaced when you knew what the numbers were hiding. David exhaled slowly and opened the bottom drawer of the cabinet beside him. Inside, stacks of paper sat in worn folders, some yellowed at the corners, some marked in red ink from a time when he'd still been trying to prove what he already knew in his gut. The numbers had been altered, not by error, but by intention. And the hand behind it was one he'd once trusted like a brother Conrad Whitmore. He hadn't touched these files in nearly 2 years, after the hearings, after the forced statements, after the media painted him as either a fool or a conspirator. David had let it go, or told himself he had. Now, with a 12-year-old's handwriting dragging his ghosts back into the light, he wasn't so sure. He spread out one of the old audit reports lines of coded investment trails, dates, fund transfers, dummy holdings. The Cayman flows were the ones he never had full access to. Conrad had called them buffer positions, just a temporary offload to manage short-term volatility. But there had been no volatility that week, just silence. David pulled out a document, an internal ledger copy he'd kept against protocol, marked private. And there it was, a sequence of transactions, half erased, half obscured, but faintly visible beneath the ink. Eliza's diagram had marked that exact break, without names, without access, just numbers, and the logic only someone unclouded by ego or denial could see. He leaned back, hand over his mouth, eyes locked on the napkin again. There was no way she could have known, unless... He stood, opened a different drawer, and took out a small flash drive labeled D-Trace. It held a backup from his last attempt to trace the funds, an effort that had collapsed when his own clearance was revoked. He inserted it into the old laptop and watched it boot, its fan wheezing like it hadn't run in years. As the screen flickered, David opened the folder and dropped Eliza's diagram beside it. Within minutes, he was matching coordinates she had drawn with nodes in the model he had once believed only he could read. He looked over at her. She hadn't stirred, just the faint rhythm of her breathing in the dark. David returned to the table, rested both elbows on the wood, and pressed his fingers together beneath his nose. He'd promised himself he wouldn't go back into this, that there was no use, that what was gone couldn't be recovered. But now, the map had a new path, and the person drawing it was asleep on his couch. He whispered aloud, more to himself than to her. I should leave this alone. But the line came back to him, her voice, quiet, clear. I don't know who's good. But mistakes don't lie. And suddenly, silence no longer felt safe. The morning air was brittle with fog, the kind that dulled edges and made buildings look like outlines drawn in charcoal. David zipped up his coat, glanced once toward the street to make sure Eliza was still beside him, and nodded at the bookstore's cracked glass door. It opened with the jingle of an old bell that hadn't rung right in years. Civic Center Plaza still slept in slow waves at this hour. Only the homeless and the early commuters shared the sidewalks. Inside, the shop smelled of dust and old ink. The shelves were uneven, patched with handwritten labels. David led Eliza toward the back, where textbooks sat untouched between coloring books and travel guides to places no one here could afford to go. He reached for a random book, Calculus, Multivariable Methods and Applications, and handed it to her. No preface, no instruction, just an open challenge. She didn't even read the title. Just flipped it open to the middle, scanned a page, and began to write on the inside flap in pencil. A derivative appeared, then a transformation, then a quiet correction to a misprint she hadn't even paused to acknowledge. David watched in silence. The owner, an older man with a stained sweater and a name tag that read Bernie, leaned from behind the counter. His eyes narrowed, not with suspicion, but something like awe. She yours? Bernie asked. David didn't answer. Not yet. They left with the book wrapped in a brown paper bag. He paid cash. Outside, the city had begun to stretch. Delivery trucks idled by the curb. People in running shoes passed with earbuds and purpose. He led Eliza toward the edge of the plaza, where a row of food carts had begun setting up for the early lunch crowd. He bought 2 breakfast sandwiches from a vendor named Ramon, who nodded when he saw David, said nothing, and added an extra napkin. They sat on a bench where the paint peeled at the arms, watching pigeons fight over a dropped pastry. You always this quiet when you're not doing math? David asked. Eliza shrugged, her eyes on the pigeons. Math doesn't interrupt you. He handed her the sandwich. She took it, held it for a moment, then bit in. No thank you, no comment. Just a hunger she didn't try to hide. After a few bites, he asked, Where'd you learn all that? She looked straight ahead. Bits and pieces. I stayed at libraries. Some foster homes had books. Some had Wi-Fi. You ever go to school here and there? A pause. Mostly there. He nodded. But the blog, that's yours. She pulled out an old phone. The screen was cracked diagonally, the case held together with tape. With a few swipes, she opened a site. Simple white background, dozens of posts, each a mathematical question, followed by a long, detailed breakdown, some labeled unverified, others tagged with obscure academic keywords. David scrolled. The language was too clean to be cut and paste, too precise to be copied, and under one post, he noticed the name in the comments. Dr. Emery Lawton, MIT Applied Mathematics Department. The comment read, If this isn't a joke, whoever wrote this should not be on a sidewalk. I'd like to talk. David's breath caught. You ever reach out? He asked. Eliza shook her head. Didn't see the point. Why not? No one hires kids from shelters, especially ones without a last name anyone respects. He leaned back, watching her. She didn't say it with resentment, just a kind of weathered certainty, like she'd learned to speak the truth without bothering to make it sound pretty. What about your mom? He asked gently. She looked down at her hands, then pressed her thumbs together until her knuckles turned white. She died 3 years ago. Asthma, no insurance. Clinic sent us home. David said nothing. He knew the shape of that silence, the kind that didn't leave when the sentence ended. Eliza looked up again, her voice lower now. I stayed in the system for a while, but every time I got moved, I lost something. Books, clothes, names. It was easier to just stay out. He placed a hand on her shoulder, not heavy, not dramatic, just there. She didn't move away. From across the plaza, a woman walked past, Mid-40s, gray coat, structured posture. She slowed as she neared them. Her eyes scanned David's face, narrowed slightly, then passed on without a word. David watched her go. "Do you know her?" Eliza asked. He nodded slowly. "Melissa Tran. Used to work under me, back when the numbers still listened to me." She didn't say hi. "No," he said quietly. She didn't. And just then, for the first time in a long while, he wondered who was keeping tabs on whom. The Mission District Library stood like an artifact between new coffee shops and art galleries. The brass handles on its main doors were dulled by time, and the marble floor inside bore the soft dents of thousands of footsteps that had passed long before Eliza's and David's. It was quiet not with silence, but with the hum of pages turning, of pencils moving across yellowed paper, of lives being researched and forgotten in the same breath. David led her past the general stacks into a side room lined with binders and file boxes labeled by year, by institution. This part of the building held old bank ledgers, records dating back to when numbers were written by hand, and fraud meant something someone physically did, not just clicked. He pulled out a folder and laid it on the table, dust blooming up in the air between them. "Let's try something," he said. "These are transfer sheets from BNC Holdings 1987 through 89. Nobody ever flagged them, but something always felt off." Eliza said nothing, just opened the folder and read. He gave her a pen, then stepped back. For nearly 2 hours, neither of them spoke. Occasionally, David would glance over and see her tapping her temple lightly, lips moving with soundless figures. She didn't just do math, she sifted it, like someone who had learned to listen to numbers the way others listened to voices, what was said, what was skipped, what was meant. By the end, she had built a schematic out of index cards and torn notebook pages, lines connected in loops, some dotted, some solid. She handed it to him and waited. David leaned in. First, the obvious pattern. Yes. She had caught the misbalance between wire timings and currency fluctuations. Then, deeper 3 small deviations circled in red. 3 links no one had ever thought to look at, because they hadn't existed as entries. They had been built through timing, not record. He didn't smile immediately, but when he did, it was the kind of smile that came from deep down, the kind that surprised even his own face. "You just taught me something," he said. Eliza tilted her head. "I did. You read accounts like people read music." She blinked once, unsure if that was praise or observation. They left the library as the afternoon light turned amber across the sidewalk. A chill had crept into the wind again. David pointed to a corner pizza shop tucked between a laundromat and a tax services kiosk. "Come on, you've earned carbs." They took a booth near the back, where the red vinyl seats stuck a little and the blinds filtered in stripes of sun. David ordered a large slice for each of them and 2 root beers. Eliza poked at the ice with her straw. He asked no more questions. She volunteered nothing. It was comfortable, that way. Until she spoke. Quiet, almost like asking herself, "Do you think I should go back to school?" David didn't answer right away. He watched her chew, watched the hesitation behind her eyes, not fear, not even doubt, just something else. The ache of not knowing if the world would open the door if she knocked. He set his drink down. "I think," he said carefully, "you're already ahead of most people in school." "That's not what I meant. I know." He reached across the table, not to pat her hand, not to comfort her, just to tap once on the rim of her glass. "I think you want to belong to something again. That's different." She looked down at her plate. "Math makes sense. School doesn't always. Then let's figure it out together." And for the first time, she smiled without caution. From behind the counter, a young man in a green apron leaned toward the register and whispered to his manager, Is that David Langston?" The manager didn't look up from the ticket machine. "Langston. You mean that Wall Street guy who lost $500 million? Yeah. He was all over Bloomberg like 2 years ago, at the booth." David had heard it. He didn't flinch. Eliza didn't notice. She was too busy drawing with the condensation on the table. David reached for a napkin, wiped her finger trail before it soaked through, and said, "We'll get you more books. And maybe a hoodie that doesn't leak." She grinned. "What about a calculator?" "You don't need one," he said, "but I'll get you one anyway." Outside, the sun had begun to fall behind the rooftops. She didn't look back. But he knew something had changed. The phone rang early, too early. David had barely poured hot water over his instant coffee when the landlord's number lit up on the screen. He let it ring twice before picking up. "Mr. Langston." The voice came quick, clipped. "I've had someone anonymous reach out about your unit. Says you've got a minor living with you. That's a legal issue, you know." David pinched the bridge of his nose. "She's not living with me. She's between placements. I'm providing food and warmth. That's all. Still, you might want to get ahead of it. If someone calls CPS, I can't be involved." The call ended before David could respond. Eliza was sitting on the couch, still in the oversized hoodie he'd found for her. She didn't ask what the call was about. She didn't need to. By 10 o'clock, they were sitting in a small office inside the Family and Youth Services building just south of Soma. The chairs were too close to the floor. The fluorescent lighting made everything look like a cheap courtroom drama. Across the desk sat a woman in a red wool coat, her posture too poised to be nervous. She flipped through a file without rushing. Her nameplate read, "Melissa Tran, Case Coordinator." She finally looked up. "Well, this is unexpected." David didn't move. "It's not what it looks like, isn't it?" She tilted her head slightly. "You take in a homeless child, no record of custody, and given your past public history." He didn't flinch. "I'm not exploiting her. I'm helping her." Eliza said nothing. Her legs didn't swing. She sat very still, the way someone learns to in places where silence means survival. Melissa rested her elbows on the table. "You know, I interned at Whitmore Capital. Remember that I remember you were sharp," David replied. "Sharper than most." Her smile was faint. "And you were generous, but blind." He nodded. "I'm seeing better now." She flipped another page. "You filed this temporary guardianship form yesterday, unnotarized. It's a placeholder," he said, "until we can file a proper petition. She has no active caseworker. She's been living in alleyways." Melissa looked at Eliza. "Is that true?" Eliza met her gaze without blinking. "Most nights. I slept outside the aquarium. It's warmer near the vents." Melissa nodded slowly, lips pressing into a line. After a few beats, she closed the file and stood. "This buys you a week. I'll mark it as a temporary placement under review. But David, I know," he said. "I know what happens if this goes sideways." Eliza stood too, her face unreadable. As they stepped out into the hallway, she spoke without looking at him. "You knew her?" "Yes. She doesn't like you." "No." There was silence between them until they reached the street. "She used to be my junior analyst," he added. "Smart, loyal, until she wasn't." Eliza nodded, not with understanding, but with the kind of acknowledgement that comes when you realize adults carry damage they rarely explain. That night, David sat at the table with every piece of paper Eliza had touched in the last week. He rebuilt the diagrams she'd sketched, laid them beside his old files, and started drawing lines between the two. At 1:13 a.m., he stopped. The trail was real, not just clever, not just coincidence. The missing funds, the ones that disappeared right before Conrad sold off Langston assets, they hadn't gone far. They had been layered, divided, and hidden in microfund entries spread across overseas partners. Eliza's math had predicted it. With enough pattern analysis, they could trace it all. But the thought lingered. If Melissa reported today's meeting, Eliza wouldn't have a week. She'd have a van at the curb tomorrow. And David, with no legal leverage, would be forced to stand aside as she was taken back into a system that saw her as a case number with high risk and low funding. He closed the folder slowly. Maybe it wasn't the numbers that were going to betray him this time. Maybe it was someone who knew exactly how his numbers used to lie. The sky over San Francisco was a dull sheet of gray, not raining yet, but holding its breath like the city knew something was about to break. David was already dressed by 5:30, a beat-up duffel at his feet, coffee untouched. He watched Eliza sleeping on the pull-out sofa, her legs curled in tight like she was still used to sleeping against alley walls. He waited until the first light slipped through the blinds before touching her shoulder. "Eliza," he said softly. "Time to get up." She sat up instantly, blinking at him, then at the clock. "Is it Melissa?" "Not yet," he said, "but we're out of time either way." She nodded once, no protest, no fear, just that quiet readiness he was learning to both admire and resent. It wasn't right for a child to always be ready to move. They packed quickly only what she could carry on her back. He handed her a black phone, low-tech, but retrofitted. "It's already set up. Just open this icon to send messages. It's encrypted, untraceable, and wipes every 12 hours. She held it like a glass knife. "You trust me with this. I trust what you're building." They left separately. David gave her a transit card and instructions. She'd take the N Judah westbound to Sunset, get off near 22nd Avenue. There, a used bookstore sat between a laundromat and a dry cleaner. A man named Terrence, an old friend of David's from his college days, ran the place like it was a cathedral of forgotten things. David had already called ahead. "She doesn't talk much," he told Terrence. "Let her stay in the back room. She's sharp. Might alphabetize your whole warehouse in a week." David himself boarded BART eastbound to Berkeley. There, he would knock on a door he hadn't touched in over a decade, the office of Camille Reyes, now a practicing attorney specializing in elder advocacy and emergency guardianship petitions. She looked surprised, but not unkind when she saw him. "I heard you were gone," she said. "I was," he answered, "but I need legal ground to stand on fast." She didn't ask who the girl was. She just opened a drawer and pulled out a packet. "You've got 3 days. Max. If child services files before we do, she's theirs. No hearing, no nuance." Back in the city, at Family and Youth Services, Melissa Tran sat in front of her monitor. She had hesitated once, but only once. Then she submitted the report. The document moved up the chain like a coin rolling toward the edge of a table. But bureaucracy was a strange beast. The file landed on the desk of Jordan Claywell, a mid-tier supervisor who now spent more time golfing than auditing. He remembered David from undergrad, the guy who tutored him through Econ 302 and brought hot soup when Jordan caught mono before finals. The name stuck. Claywell clicked hold on the digital review. His screen blinked, temporary hold review needed within 72 hours. He leaned back and took a sip of his lukewarm coffee. "Let's see where this goes," he murmured. Sunset District smelled of fog and burnt toast. Eliza found the bookstore easily its front window coated with dust and flyers for events that hadn't happened since 2014. Inside, Terrence didn't ask for her name. He handed her a key, pointed to the stockroom, and went back to reading a graphic novel. By nightfall, she had stacked 32 boxes by genre and reorganized 3 shelves. But she wasn't here to arrange fiction. Once the store closed, she slipped into the corner behind the bulk sale bins, pulled out the old phone, and opened the secure app. Her fingers flew, entered secondary trade node. Transactional logs exceed estimates. Beginning phase 1 of trace pattern design. She sent the message. Then, in the quiet that followed, she folded a piece of receipt paper into a tiny swan and placed it on the corner of a ledger marked Wholesalers, 1999. In Berkeley, David sat in Camille's office, staring at a blank form. "What if this doesn't work?" he asked. Camille glanced at him over her glasses. "Then she goes back into the system. And if it does, she gets to stay," Camille said. "But someone's going to ask why you care so much. Be ready to answer that." David looked out the window. "She doesn't want protection," he said finally. "She wants to be seen for what she is." Camille closed the file. "Then let's make sure no one can look away." He nodded, the words echoing deeper than he expected. She didn't look back, but he knew. Something had changed. The back room of the bookstore smelled of dust, dried glue, and old paper, stacked between crates of forgotten encyclopedias and romance novels from the 70s. Eliza had carved out a small corner for herself. By now, her sleeping bag was folded to the side, and every inch of the wooden floor was covered in loose sheets. Hand-drawn graphs overlapped with flow diagrams and strange numeric sequences. In the center, a crude sketch of a spiderweb sprawled outward, Eliza's own creation, which she had quietly named the Ruins Network. To her, it wasn't just data. It was bone and breath evidence of something broken, still pulsing underneath the surface of global finance. She tracked false accounts that led to other false accounts, then to dead-end firms with post office box addresses. But what made her hands tremble wasn't just the complexity, it was the rhythm. The transfers weren't random. They repeated like breath, cyclical, timed, global, every 46 hours. The same pattern re-emerged, linking Zurich, Singapore, London, like someone was playing a song, and the whole world was nodding along without realizing it. By noon, she paused only to drink half a bottle of orange soda Terrence had left her. She didn't know if he knew what she was doing, but he never asked. He just muttered, "You're weirder than the last kid who crashed here," and dropped off more paper. Across the bay, David stood at the window of the civil courthouse in Berkeley. His application for temporary guardianship had been denied insufficient proof of stable housing, they said. He had offered tax records, testimonies, even photographs of the apartment. It didn't matter. The word fraud still floated next to his name in their system. Stains like that didn't wash out. He left the building with his tie loosened and his coat unbuttoned. The afternoon sun hit the pavement hard, but the heat didn't reach him. He returned to Camille's office, slumped in the chair, hands flat on his knees. Denial, she asked, though she already knew. He nodded. "You still have 48 hours before the report clears its next review," she reminded him. "She's building something," David said quietly. "Some kind of model, not just numbers. A system, a mirror of what Conrad's buried." Camille frowned. "You mean Whitmore? You think he's still running something under the radar?" David didn't answer right away. He pulled his laptop from the case and opened an old market monitoring software he had installed years ago during his audit consulting days. Slowly, methodically, he fed in the transaction timestamps Eliza had flagged. There it was. A pulse, like a heartbeat, buried in the noise, regular, engineered, intentional. Money moving across borders with surgical precision. No one saw it because no one looked for a rhythm. They only watched for spikes. David's hands curled into fists. He sat still for a long time before he said, "Only one person I know could orchestrate this. Conrad." Back at the bookstore, the light outside dimmed. Eliza lit a cheap desk lamp and continued drawing. She traced a new loop in red ink and typed a message on the phone David gave her, "Algorithm 43% complete. Pattern suggests distribution not random. Someone's orchestrating global trade rhythm." She hit send in Berkeley. David's phone vibrated. He read the message, and a chill rose in his spine. This wasn't just theft. It was control global, systemic, and elegant in the way only Conrad could design. David launched another query into the system, cross-referencing data with public market indices and offshore records. Then something hit him. A firm in Luxembourg, dormant since 2008, suddenly lit up again 2 months ago, with exactly the same pulse interval Eliza identified. He reached for the phone, dialed. No answer. Again. Voicemail. "Eliza, call me," he said into the quiet. "Don't keep going if you're alone. Just call me." He hung up, stared at the screen, then again, and louder this time. He called her name. The silence that followed had a weight to it, as if the air itself was waiting for something to crack. The last thing Eliza saw before she shoved open the back door of the bookstore was the man's hand reaching into his coat pocket, not for a weapon, but for something worse, a badge that didn't quite match the city's official design. He had appeared at noon, well-dressed, calm, saying he was from a youth outreach office. She watched his eyes more than his lips, too smooth, too rehearsed. When he asked her to follow him to a safe location, she asked for a bathroom break. That's when she slipped out the side, heart pounding but face unreadable. She didn't stop running until she reached the back lot of a laundromat 2 blocks away. There, she ducked behind a soda machine, pulled out her phone, and typed a single-line false agent. ID mismatch. Escaped. Tracking vehicle now. Then, after glancing back toward the street, she noted the license plate number CA8YQ1X2. At the same time, across the bay in Oakland, David sat across from Marcus Keller in a booth that smelled of stale beer and wood polish. The bar hadn't changed in 20 years. Marcus hadn't either. His gray stubble had grown out, and his suits were now replaced by denim jackets, but the eyes were still razor sharp. David spread the printouts across the table. Marcus examined them silently. This looks like synthetic analysis, Marcus murmured. Machine learning level predictions, timing intervals, cross-market fraud. Who did this? David took a sip of water before answering. A 12-year-old. Her name is Eliza. Marcus looked at him, skeptical. Come on, David. I thought the same, until she showed me proof nobody else caught. You ever seen the Zurich, London, Singapore loop fire in the same pattern every 46 hours? Marcus didn't respond. He just leaned back, exhaled through his nose. That alone said enough. Tell me something, David said. If someone controlled the tempo of global liquidity, timed every pulse, every dip, what would that mean? Marcus drummed his fingers on the table. It means they're not stealing money anymore. They're controlling influence, flow, pressure. It's not about taking 100 million. It's about deciding when others lose theirs. Silence filled the booth. Marcus finally leaned forward. If Whitmore's behind this, you're not poking a fraud case. You're walking into economic warfare, and if you found a way in, trust me, they've already noticed. David nodded slowly. He didn't say what he feared most. Eliza was alone when he tried to call. No answer, not even a receipt that she'd seen the message. He thanked Marcus, tucked the files away, and hurried back to the apartment. The ride felt longer than usual. Every red light dragged like it was daring him to panic. He kept telling himself it was fine, that Eliza would reach out, that she'd just lost track of time. But when he reached his door, something shifted in his gut. The lock wasn't broken, but it wasn't locked either. He pushed it open. Nothing was disturbed. No drawers opened. No signs of a break-in. But in the center of the living room floor, just past the cheap rug with its frayed corners, lay a single sheet of paper. No seal, no name. Just a note, written in small block letters. We know what you're looking for. Stop. He read it once, then again. The walls felt thinner, the windows less secure. He closed the door, locked it, pulled the curtains, and then his phone vibrated. A message from Eliza Agent's tag, registered to defunct org dissolved in 2012. Likely private hire. I'm safe. Resuming analysis. David didn't breathe for a moment. Then, finally, he typed back, good, stay hidden. And Eliza, no more solo field trips. He didn't hit send right away. He sat there, staring at the note. And something in him said this wasn't just about finance anymore. David didn't go to the police. He knew the system too well. Reporting that note would trigger forms, interviews, scrutiny, and more eyes on Eliza. That he couldn't allow. Instead, he tucked the paper beneath an old utilities manual on his bookshelf, opened his laptop, and sent a low-frequency encrypted ping to the hidden channel they'd agreed upon. It was short. One line, switch platforms, ghost mode, begin migration, across the city, in the quiet corner of the Presidio branch library. Eliza sat cross-legged on the floor beside a dusty shelf of obsolete reference books. Her hoodie pulled low, sleeves rolled over her knuckles. She looked like any kid doing homework too late. But her screen glowed with something else, a sea of raw data, code, and anomaly markers she'd handwritten over the past week. The message from David reached her in seconds. She didn't reply with words. Instead, she opened a hidden portal on a forum for global math competitions, buried in an archived thread. She uploaded a partial string of the algorithm carefully scrambled and embedded as a solution to a mock proof problem. Moments later, a user called Phoenix87 responded. His reply was just a string of math symbols, but she decoded the true meaning behind them. Don't rush. Secure base first. It was David, even in short code. She knew his rhythm. She smiled faintly, then got to work. Bit by bit, she broke the algorithm down, embedding each piece into anonymous university servers, academic challenges, and dummy research journals. The net widened, and so did her silence. By late evening, David sat alone in his apartment, light from his desk lamp pooling over stacks of printouts. His body ached, his breath shallower than usual, but he pressed on, scanning Eliza's most recent updates, cross-referencing them with International Clearinghouse timestamps. He didn't see it coming. It began as a tightening in his chest, sharp and strange, then a cold wash over his shoulders. He dropped the pen in his hand, tried to reach for the phone, but the edge of the table blurred, the floor tilted. He gripped the USB hard in his fist and somehow stumbled to the door before collapsing just outside it. A neighbor found him. The ambulance came fast. At UCSF Medical Center, the emergency team worked in quiet urgency. David's breathing stabilized, but his heart rhythm was erratic. In his right hand, even as they wheeled him into triage, he refused to let go of the USB. A nurse tried to loosen it. He wouldn't release it. They called the next contact listed in his phone, Marcus Keller. Marcus arrived 35 minutes later, winded, smelling faintly of whiskey and asphalt. A nurse met him in the waiting room. He's stable, but weak. He kept saying, "Give it to Marcus. You're Marcus I am." She handed over the flash drive, still warm from David's hand. Back at his apartment, Marcus plugged it in. He wasn't a coder, but he didn't need to be. The screen filled with diagrammed loops, flashing markets, time zones, names, Eliza's work part math, part map, part indictment, and in the corner of the screen, a small chat notification blinked once. He clicked. It was a message. Simple, calm, certain. Algorithm, 87% complete. Don't worry. I'm safe. Marcus sat back in his chair. The city outside roared on as usual, but in that tiny room, something else moved beneath the noise. Marcus stood in the hallway of the SEC building, a worn manila folder in one hand and a tension in his jaw he hadn't felt in years. Inside the folder were 36 pages printed, highlighted, annotated by hand. Eliza's algorithm, David's trail, his own cross-referencing. Together, they formed a blueprint, a map of fracture lines running through the global financial system, all leading back to one man, Conrad Whitmore. He placed it on the front desk and spoke just one sentence to the receptionist. "This belongs on Director Fletcher's desk." Now. He didn't stay to explain. That same evening, in a back room of the Stanford Youth Financial Forum, Eliza tied her ponytail tighter. Her ID badge read Lena Rios, a name borrowed from an old book cover she'd once used as a bookmark. She wasn't here to win a prize. She just wanted to be heard once without being seen as the girl from the street. Marcus stood by the back door of the auditorium, holding a USB. The hall was packed young analysts, hedge fund interns, skeptical investors, a few professors nursing coffee and expectations. Eliza had prepared a presentation, but Marcus would be her voice. He stepped on stage when her name was called. His presence drew confused looks. Whispers rippled. Some chuckled. "Aren't you a bit old to be in the youth section?" One of the moderators joked. Marcus didn't flinch. He plugged in the USB. "This isn't about age," he said. "It's about precision." The screen lit up with data webs, trading loops, and something new, a rhythmic pulse of microtransactions linking offshore accounts with regulatory blind spots. Each layer peeled away like sediment. The further it went, the quieter the room became. By slide 10, you could hear a cough echo. By slide 22, a man in the front row, a compliance director from Zurich, leaned forward with his hand covering his mouth. By slide 36, a woman from Goldman Sachs whispered, "That's impossible." When it ended, Marcus looked around. Then someone asked, "Who built this?" Marcus held the silence for just a beat too long, then answered, "A child the city threw away." There was a flicker on the screen, a video. The angle was simple shot from a public library webcam, grainy, with fluorescent lighting casting soft shadows on the girl's cheek. Eliza. She looked straight into the camera, not smiling, not pleading. My name doesn't matter. I don't want to bring anyone down. I just want the truth to stop hiding. The auditorium held its breath. In a small corner of the room, a junior associate from the SEC, someone barely 24, someone who remembered Marcus's name, stood up and left, phone already dialing, outside the building. Eliza waited on a bench behind a row of hedges, earphones in, not watching the screen. But she heard her voice echo through the walls, heard the silence after it. She didn't smile, but her fingers curled into the fabric of her jeans, holding something tight she didn't have words for yet. It was just past noon when David stepped out of the cab onto East 55th Street. The cold air bit into his lungs, sharp against the tender weight still lingering in his chest from the hospital. The doorman at St. Regis greeted him with a neutral nod, but the air inside the hotel was thicker, marble floors too polished, staff too rehearsed. David adjusted the scarf around his neck and walked straight to the elevator without asking for directions. He already knew where they wanted him. The 18th floor was silent. No background music, no staff at the desk, just the hum of the city pressing faintly against the tall windows. A single door stood open, room 1802, the suite. He stepped in. Conrad Whitmore stood by the glass wall, hands clasped behind his back, gazing out at Manhattan like it was a chessboard. The skyline was muted in the winter haze, towers fading into white above Central Park. He didn't turn when David entered, just spoke. I wasn't sure you'd come. David walked slowly toward the table, sat down without removing his coat. I wasn't sure either. Conrad turned, finally, wearing a smile that was neither smug nor warm, just controlled. David, you were always better with numbers than with timing. David didn't answer. Conrad sat across from him, placed a small tumbler of scotch on the table, untouched. I've read the filings, the leaks, the whispers. I know what you're piecing together. He folded his hands. I'm not here to debate. I'm here to offer. David's eyes narrowed. Offer. Conrad leaned forward, voice calm like a sermon. 50%. That's half of the profits from the offshore routing streams. You pull back the report. Let the heat die down. I dismantle the Cayman paths myself, and nobody gets hurt. David stared at him. You think this is still about money? Conrad's tone flattened. Everything is about money. David reached into his coat, pulled out a USB, and laid it gently on the table. I didn't come to negotiate. Conrad blinked, just once, then smiled. Wider. Then you came to lose. He stood, as if signaling the end of the meeting, but before he could turn, the room changed. The door opened. Marcus stepped in, flanked by two men in dark suits, badges visible, expressions unreadable. One of them closed the door behind him. Conrad's smile slipped, just slightly. What is this? Marcus stepped beside David, holding a tablet already syncing with the receiver embedded in the USB. He tapped the screen. The audio began to play. Every word from Conrad since David entered. Clear. Undeniable. You bastard, Conrad muttered, but then came the final blow. The conference table flickered. A small embedded projector on the side of the table, activated remotely, lit up the glass surface with a video feed. Eliza's face appeared, not grainy this time, clear, composed, confident. She looked straight into the camera, into the room, into Conrad's eyes. You destroyed my father's company, she said, but you won't destroy the truth. Conrad froze, pale. The room felt suddenly colder. He looked around, but there was no one left to charm, no phone to grab, no exit that wouldn't lead him straight into the hands of the SEC. His shoulders slackened. David watched him carefully, but said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Conrad didn't reach for the scotch, didn't argue, didn't blink when they read him his rights. As the door closed behind him, David remained seated. Outside, Manhattan kept moving unaware, uncaring. But Inside that room, something long buried had finally been unearthed. He didn't look back, but he knew something had shifted. The media storm came like a cold wave, swallowing the nuance of truth in favor of spectacle. Within 48 hours of the Phoenix Project's presentation, headlines erupted across major networks, some hailing Eliza as a genius, others questioning her very existence. Child prodigy or stolen code. Homeless girl hacks global market, real or ruse. David Langston's puppet for David. The noise was unbearable. He'd faced humiliation before, public disgrace, the hollowing echo of empty boardrooms, but this felt personal. This was about Eliza, a child who'd never asked for any of this, who had tried to solve a puzzle and now found herself trapped inside it. Conrad Whitmore had been suspended from his own firm. His assets were frozen pending a full-scale investigation, but he still had influence, and whispers of strategic countersuits circled like birds over a dying tree. The worst came not from his enemies, but from those who claimed to be allies. At a private roundtable inside the SEC's regional office, David, Marcus, and Eliza sat across from executives and legal advisors. A woman from a prestigious investment group flipped through Eliza's portfolio with a tight-lipped expression. "She has no stable housing," she said, "no academic certification, no guardian of record until last week. We cannot publicly support a figure who undermines the credibility of our field." David clenched his jaw. Marcus spoke, steady but firm. "What if we fund it ourselves? Start an independent institute, open source, built on transparency and education." A man near the end of the table let out a quiet laugh. "Good luck pitching that to shareholders." David stood, slowly, deliberately. He pulled a folder from his briefcase and laid it on the polished table. Langston Institute. Office lease signed 2 days ago. Nonprofit status filed. Provisional charter approved in San Mateo County. And yes, legal guardianship, confirmed under Emergency Statute 12.9, effective retroactively. He tapped the last page. Eliza Monroe, Director of Research. The room went silent. Even the woman who'd dismissed her earlier paused, fingers hovering above her coffee cup. It wasn't defiance in David's voice, it was something quieter, like a father stating a simple truth. "She belongs here, whether you like it or not." Then the door opened. A young assistant stepped in, hesitant. He whispered something into the SEC advisor's ear and handed him a letter. The man unfolded it, read, blinked, then cleared his throat. "It's from MIT, Office of the Provost." All eyes turned. The advisor read aloud, "We have reviewed the independent publication submitted under the name Eliza Monroe. The mathematical coherence, originality, and predictive modeling presented in the Phoenix series exceed the standard metrics for doctoral-level scholarship. We extend an invitation for Ms. Monroe to visit our Cambridge campus as a distinguished research guest." Eliza sat still. For the first time in weeks, David saw something shift in her shoulders, not pride, not shock, just relief, like the slow exhale of a breath she'd been holding too long. But the room stayed quiet, no claps, no apologies, only the knowledge that something irreversible had just happened. And outside the glass windows, the rain had finally stopped. The room held its breath. It was the kind of silence you only heard in places where power gathered, where men in suits traded decisions worth millions. And applause usually followed those with perfect diction, not patched shoes. But today was different. Eliza stood alone beneath the stage lights of MIT's Killian Hall. Her blazer hung awkwardly on her thin frame, sleeves covering half her hands. Behind her, the massive screen flickered no title card, no charts, just a grainy black and white still from Union Square, where a girl once sat beneath a broken umbrella, drawing something onto a pizza box lid with a dry erase marker. The audience stared. They had been told to expect a presentation, a keynote, something structured. Instead, they watched. Image after image appeared Eliza, tracing shapes on the library wall in Presidio, her fingers smudged with ink. A snapshot from a security camera, her asleep at a corner table with folders under her arm. Then, a whiteboard covered in hand-drawn logic nodes titled only Fragments Wanting to Belong. She hadn't said a word yet. From the front row, David sat quietly. He wore a dark suit that no longer carried weight in finance, but held more dignity in that moment than any tailored tuxedo in the room. He didn't blink. He didn't need to. He'd already seen every image, lived every missing piece of it. And now, so did they. The moderator finally cleared his throat. "Miss Monroe, would you care to explain your academic background?" Eliza stepped forward. She didn't fumble with notes, didn't look to anyone for approval. "I learned outside," she said, "on the streets, and from someone who once lost everything, but still chose to teach." A pause. "I was told I didn't belong in the world of finance, because I didn't come from the right schools, or have the right parents, or even a bed for more than a few nights. But math doesn't care who's holding the pencil. A beat. And neither should you." Someone in the back clapped, then another, and then the room was full of hands older, wealthier, trained to weigh value by pedigree, now clapping for a girl in borrowed shoes. Later, after the talk ended and the formal introductions resumed, a gray-haired man in a checkered tie approached Eliza and offered her a small gift box. Inside was a silver hair clip, shaped like the infinity symbol with subtle etched equations along the band. "This," he said softly, "belonged to my daughter. She never made it to this stage. Thank you for standing on it today." Eliza held it gently. No words. A woman nearby whispered, almost to herself, "Thank you for reminding us that genius wears many faces and sometimes worn-out souls." The evening concluded without a gala, without champagne, just a room full of people who, for once, saw not through statistics or resumes, but the honesty of a story told with no intention of impressing. And in that space where status usually spoke, first, truth had found its voice. Backstage, as David helped Eliza pack the projector, she glanced up. "They don't see me the same anymore." He smiled, tired but warm. "No," he said, "they finally see you." She nodded once, quietly, then stepped outside into the Boston night, where the wind was sharp but didn't bite as much as it used to. A full year had passed. Where once stood the rusted skeleton of a defunct strip mall off El Camino Real in San Mateo, now rose the unpolished yet unmistakable beginnings of something new. Not slick, not grand, but rooted. The new sign had just gone up that morning, its paint still drying in the corner's Langston Institute for Unseen Minds. There was no ribbon cutting, no press, no headlines. But inside the courtyard, the sound of laughter was louder than any speech. A group of kids 10, maybe 12, sat cross-legged on foam mats, shaping paper into geometry. Some traced symbols onto chalkboards nailed to tree trunks. A little girl with tight braids and wide eyes struggled to fold her star just right, beside her. Eliza leaned in, hoodie sleeves rolled, voice soft. "Don't force it," she said. "Let the paper show you what it wants to be." The girl looked up at her like she was made of something rare, across the yard, near the planter boxes of basil and marigold. David knelt in the dirt, a straw hat shielding his face from the afternoon sun. His hands were muddy, content. A small boy with band-aids on both knees ran up and asked, breathless, "Mr. Langston, do we have a test tomorrow?" David set down his trowel, squinted playfully. "Yup," he said. "We're testing courage. See who's brave enough to be wrong and keep going." The boy blinked, then grinned. In the modest library they'd built inside what used to be a chain clothing store. Eliza unlocked a drawer. She pulled out a folded piece of paper, aged, wrinkled, but untouched. It was the sketch she'd made months ago, 2 figures in the rain, one holding an umbrella, the other handing over a paper crane. She pinned it to the bulletin board above the reading couch. Beneath it, she wrote in permanent marker, "This is where we began." There was no ceremony, no applause. Only the quiet kind of beginning that doesn't need validation to be real. Back outside, David sat on the bench under the jacaranda tree. Eliza dropped beside him, kicking off her shoes. Neither spoke for a long while. Children darted across the grass. One tripped, got up, kept running. David watched them with a look only men who've lost and rebuilt can wear. Eliza finally asked, "Do you ever think about everything that had to break just to make this?" He tilted his head, considering. "Sometimes," he said, "but mostly I think about how you still showed up. They didn't smile. They didn't need to. They just sat. Two people who had once stood on opposite sides of the system, now shoulder to shoulder, not because they had become the same, but because they had stopped needing to be." A girl tossed a paper crane into the sky, and it stayed aloft just long enough to remind them how far things could fly, when someone believed they should. The morning light slipped through the old windows, casting quiet shapes on the floor where laughter now lived. There were still questions no one could answer, still scars no one could erase. But the silence between them no longer hurt. It held. Sometimes, what saves us isn't a miracle. It's a place where we're seen without needing to explain. A chair left out, a name spoken without flinch, a story that no one rewrites, just continues with gentleness. And maybe that's enough.